Good morning, everyone. Welcome. Happy Friday. Welcome to the Friday Forum. Wherever you are joining us from, whether it's YouTube or Twitter or LinkedIn or Facebook, we're glad to have you. Our guests today are Margot Edelman. She is the general manager of Edelman's Bay Area Hub, and Dan Susong. He is the chair of the Edelman's U.S. Tech Sector. Today, they will be sharing their findings from the Edelman Trust Barometer, Trust in Technology, and that's been a really important resource for communicators for over 22 years. And speaking of longevity, I'm super excited that today of all Friday Forums is our 75th show, but who's counting? Since 2020, what honestly started off as a really informal opportunity for communicators in Silicon Valley to get together and navigate through the pandemic has turned into what we call the industry's team meeting. And we've had very engaging and inspiring speakers from across the country every single week, or almost every single week. But I'm so proud of the contributions by our board members to keep this content of value, whether it is career advice or information that you can apply in your work with your organization or with clients. So a shout out today to all of our board members who are participating today. We'd love to hear from you. Tell us where you are joining us from. We'd like to say Silicon Valley is a state of mind. So I love it when I see people from outside our geographic boundaries joining us. So, and I also challenge you to connect with somebody from whichever platform you are joining us from. And I will now introduce our moderator today. She is amazing. She is our awesome. She is a consultant, strategic advisor, and a doer. She is very active in the Silicon Valley board member, as a Silicon Valley board member, and she is a frequent moderator here on the Friday Forum. And most recently, she was executive editor and chief product officer for Provoke Media, leading all of Provoke Media's flagship editorial initiatives and events. So welcome, Aarti Shah.
Thank you, Karen. And we have to celebrate the fact that this is the 75th show. I'm so honored to be here and moderating the 75th milestone of the industry's team meeting. And I think what turned Silicon Valley from a place into a mindset. And I give you all credit in terms of really, embodying that ethos and having folks from everywhere. So as Karen said, definitely let us know where you're joining in from. It's always fun to see people that are both, our neighbors here in the Valley, but also from other parts of the country and possibly the world, I guess. I see we have Sunnyvale, we have some local folks, so keep those coming. So, it is, as Karen mentioned, we have Margot Edelman here, GM of Edelman Bay Area. Margot and I talked more broadly about the 2022 trust findings, Edelman's 2022 trust findings in January. I believe you can find that, Karen, correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that should be on PRSA Silicon Valley's YouTube page. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend watching it. It's a very lively discussion on what
very lively.
Yes, right on what trust means in 2022 across all sectors, across all stakeholders. And Margot, I'm just going to give shout out to Trust. I mean, for those of you that don't know, and I'm assuming most of you do, Trust is Edelman's longstanding and highly respected thought leadership platform. It's been around for 2 decades now, right?
Over 2 decades, exactly.
Oh, yes. So it's really worth sort of digging into sort of where the bigger trends.
Older than both of us are, of course, right?
Is what?
Older than both of us are.
Yes, it is. Yes, of course. Yes, older than both of us, because we are under 2 decades, right? Hosted by teenagers today.
Exactly.
So, and also, so that's sort of the broader conversation. Today, we're going to look specifically at technology, which I'm sure all of you know has had its fair issues with trust. It's in particular in the last few years. So Margot and her colleague, Dan Susong, who is U.S. Tech Chair and head of Edelman's Austin market, will walk us through. So the way we'll structure the show is Margot and Dan will walk us through the trust findings around tech. That'll be about 30 minutes. Tell me if I'm off there. And then we'll switch over to our lively discussion. Does that sound right, Margot and Dan?
Yeah, that's perfect. And we'll try to keep it snappy on the data, just because I know the interesting part is what it all means, and fielding some questions both from you, Arthi, and then from the group. So looking forward to getting through quickly, and then we'll be ready to have a conversation.
Perfect. And we have Denver here. So we have quite a few folks from the Bay Area, but then we also have someone from Colorado. So
this looks like our hiring profile as well for San Francisco. So that's what we say at Edelman too. The Bay Area is a state of mind. So completely agree.
Okay, all right. So I will step aside and go backstage and let you two give your presentation, and then you all will see me again in about 30 minutes to have the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Arthi.
All right. Talk to you guys soon.
Great. And Paul, if you want to pull up the slides, we can jump in. I know you all have seen and heard from Margot before, but it's really nice to be with you. Thanks for having me. And if it wasn't clear, yes, I'm hailing from Austin. So very much agree. Bay Area and all tech is absolutely a state of mind. So I'm going to quickly go through the tech specific findings, just to add to what Arthi said. For those not familiar with the Trust Barometer, it's our annual look at the state of trust in institutions globally. If you want to click to the next slide, you can see a little bit about our methodology. As you can see, we strive to capture as broad of a swath of opinions that are representative of truly a cross-section of the entire globe, 28 countries, more than 1,000 folks in each country. This is really a wide-ranging source of information about the state of trust. So on the next slide, as we've mentioned, it's the 22nd year of trust. We've seen some pretty significant themes play out over the last couple of decades. The inaugural report way back in 2001 highlighted the rise of the NGO. A Person Like You, which happened to be the year I joined the firm, to date myself, was one of my favorites, and I think really signaled the coming of influencer marketing as a concept. The inequality of trust coinciding with the election in 2016 was quite interesting. This year we saw what we're calling disinformation and division driving a cycle of distrust. So today we're excited to walk through for the first time in this level of detail the tech-specific findings from that report. I also just want to mention that we're planning an entirely separate survey on tech exclusively for later this summer that's going to dig in a bit further. So excited to share those with you later this year as well.
Since another Friday Forum opportunity coming up with that.
Exactly. But for now, let's take a look at what we found in this year's report as it relates to tech. So on the next slide, headline is really that tech is under pressure. No shocker there. And I don't know if anybody caught this, but this morning at Disinformation Conference, Amy Klobuchar, of all people, actually kicked off her conversation with Kara Swisher by saying the era of just trust us for the tech companies has come to an end. And so it's really interesting context as we kind of click through some of this data. So on the next slide, you can see that globally, tech is still the most trusted of all industry, and it actually rose globally. But I do want to point out what I like to refer to as tech's half sibling over here on the far right, really dragging the anchor at 44% and declining. So an interesting note there, as obvious intermingling between social media platforms and technology companies, and a bit of a blurry line that we look forward to exploring a bit further. On the next slide, you can see that the US is a different story entirely. So check this out. US is down 3 points, and it's the only market other than Canada that took a dip. So if we take a look and start to pick apart the subsectors within tech, we can start to figure out maybe why. So on the next slide, we do just that. So 5G, down, signaling perhaps fatigue over long-term promises, short-term setbacks, constant regulatory struggles. IoT, down, signaling perhaps growing concern about the data privacy and security of it all. AI, down, signaling lack of understanding around the flurry of innovations in this space, concerns about job implications, and perhaps some frustration with AI's inability to totally solve supply chain problems that we've been seeing this year. VR, down, signaling confusion around where this technology is actually heading, how does it factor into our lives, perhaps the inequitable access to it, and the whole metaverse of it all. So some more interesting data as we look at some so the trajectory of trust across the US on the next slide. It's really interesting if you look at it from a timing standpoint. There's a downward trajectory overall, as you can see, but you notice the first dip took place right during the 2020 election cycle. I think there's some obvious reasons as to why there might be confusion and concern around technology at that time period. Then the pandemic hit, and early 2020 saw an upswing. Tech enabled us to stay connected. It enabled us to stay alive. It enabled us to get information. But then perhaps, mid-pandemic, during some of the darkest days of 21, it dipped again, perhaps due to tech's failure to solve quickly, or the continued blur between big tech and invisible tech that actually is enabling health and safety and financial success. And you'll see that we've dipped yet again. And I think it remains to see where this is going to go, and how the big tech / rest of tech tension will play out. And that's one of the biggest things we're going to try to explore in the upcoming survey, to get more specific around the differences of opinions as it relates to type of technology, size of technology, location of technology, and impact of technology. So now let's go to the next slide and we take a look at some of the demographic disparities. Income is relatively straightforward. I think this is a trend we've seen year over year. There's an interesting, very small uptick in the low income respondents. Could be, margin of error difference, or it could be perhaps a glimmer of hope around improvement to access of tech among those less financially bolstered. But in general, we still see this split that indicates that innovations and technology continue to benefit those with the means and flexibility to access it. There's a lot of work to be done there. If we look at the racial lines of difference, it's really interesting. There's obviously some nuances and historical exclusion from tech that's going on across racial lines, driving a significant difference between, for example, Black respondents and Asian respondents. And then there's also a lack of trust regarding algorithms that are included in tech, around facial recognition having more struggle with non-white faces. There are countless examples of where this, evidence of why this is actually the reality. We go to the next, some demographic breakdown. We look at sort of age range and political lines. So on the left-hand side, I'd like to suggest that this is a bit of a Trump era hangover of stoking distrust within tech. Again, that blurry line between social media platforms, though we know it's called out separately, it's sort of impossible to completely separate the two, and historical tendencies. And I was chatting with Tonya, who leads all of our research behind the Trust Barometer, and she was reminding me that we're just seeing that Republicans' trust in literally everything is down. They're constantly being told to not trust anything. So there's a bigger issue here. And I'm really curious about what and how tech can help close the gap. And that's another thing we're going to be looking into. So same goes for age groups. And I'd like to suggest that why we see Gen X, sort of in the trough here is because it's the age group that is still both largely in the workforce, but not digitally native. I think they have historically been less trusting of tech than either their older or younger counterparts. And it's interesting to see that trend kind of continue. So I think last slide for me before I hand to Margot, it's really fascinating to look at the overall drivers of societal fears in the US and how tech, its innovations, its solutions, its risks, tech really plays a larger role than any other industry in addressing or actually contributing to these fears. Job loss, cybersecurity issues, privacy issues, voting rights, access to healthcare, concerns about longevity of our planet, experiencing abusive or hateful behavior from other humans. These are all things that are either addressed or exacerbated by technology, depending on how the industry moves forward. So to dig in on how this plays out within the tech industry from an employee standpoint and how it's linked to other institutions that we measure, I'll hand it back to Margot.
Awesome. Thank you, Dan. And fascinating data. I think the stuff around Republicans and Democrats is particularly timely given everything going on. We see with the Jackson confirmation hearings, obviously everything from the Trump era. So you can really see how all that divide is just echoed in trust in technology as well. Next slide. So what does this mean? It means that for tech workers, trusted leadership actually matters more than ever. Next slide. So today, all stakeholders are really holding business accountable, perhaps in a way that they didn't before. And so in the US, we see that over half of consumers say they'll buy or advocate for brands based on their beliefs and values. This is also true for employees. Over 50% say they would choose a place to work based on a company's beliefs and values. Again, over 50% invest based on their beliefs and values. And then, we did a specific survey of institutional investors, and they're actually now subjecting companies to specific ESG scrutiny in the same way they look at a company's financial operations. So you can see this really gives the landscape that in the United States, that relationship with business has changed for consumers, for employees, and for investors to really prioritize beliefs and values, in addition to, things like financials or the operations of a company. Next slide. We also see that CEOs are actually now expected to inform policy on things like jobs and the economy, on technology and automation, wage inequality, things like global warming and climate change. So again, there is just a much higher threshold for what businesses and in particular CEOs are supposed to lead on, and just much greater expectations for what CEOs should lead on. And again, this is in particular related to areas that technology touches, like automation or like climate change, for example. And this holds true for business, CEOs of businesses at large, and also obviously holds true absolutely for CEOs in the tech sector. So again, what are the implications of this? If you are a CEO and you are in the robotic processing automation space, perhaps you want to have a focus on reskilling, for example, because again, it allows you to sort of own what you know, and what your company is good at, but do it in a way that allows you to, really tackle an important issue, again, that, people expect CEOs to have a point of view on. And again, not just point of view, but also action. Next slide. And again, this is true, as we said, not just overall, but also for the tech sector. So if you look at the data here, it shows that globally, 70% of employees in the tech sector say that they choose their employers based on beliefs. And why is this important? Because we really have switched to a world in which, the economy is still, super hot. The job market is still super tight. And so if you are a tech company and you want to win in terms of your talent attraction and retention strategy, you need to focus on beliefs and values, and you need to be promoting what your beliefs and values are in the marketplace as a way to attract the best talent and to retain your talent. Because again, that employer value proposition has shifted, and employees, again, really at this point in some ways have the upper hand, and are really able to sort of choose freely where they want to be working. Next slide. And again, going back to sort of expectations of CEOs, CEOs are really expected to be the face of change. So again, going back to that sort of global Gen Pop pool of respondents, 81% say that CEOs should be personally visible when discussing public policy with external stakeholders or the work that a company has done to benefit society. So again, and when considering a job, 60% of all employees say they expect CEOs to speak publicly about controversial social and political issues that they care about. And this is particularly true in tech. We see that 68% of those employed in the tech sector say this. So again, it's not just enough for companies to do this or to have, a nice, we call CSR report. This is actually something that, employees are expecting CEOs to speak out on. You only have to look at, the most, prominent CEOs in the tech space, like a Mark Benioff, like a Satya Nadella, to see that, these are people who are really leading from the front and are taking, a public stance on global issues, and then also taking action in ways that relate back to what their company does. So you can really see the tech sector has been leading on this, and in a lot of ways is really leading from the front in terms of delivering on employee expectations and consumer expectations. Next slide. And we can also see that really government and media have been fueling what we call the cycle of distrust that Dan talked about earlier. Next slide. So if you look here, this is, perhaps not surprising in the US, is that they say that the gap, if you look at it, there's a 30-point gap between those who say that government is a dividing force in society and those who say government is a unifying force in society. It's 57% say that it's a dividing force, pretty high. Same thing with media. 57% say media is a dividing force. And as you can see, business and then NGOs, it's much more neutral. They're equally seen as divisive, but also unifying, whereas government and media, the two of those are seen as extremely polarizing institutions. And as we can see, trust overall has declined for all U.S. institutions. All good news, or not exactly, is that all US institutions are now distrusted. So we're down in business, NGOs, government, and media. And as you can see from May 2020, government was really the only distrusted institution at that time. So, there really has been a massive shift in terms of trust, in particular in the United States, which again likely contributes to that decline in trust all up that we saw in the tech sector as well for the US. Next slide. And then finally, we see that no news sources are trusted in the US, and there has been double-digit declines in search and traditional media. And again, why is this important? The first is that we can really see that trust in technology, something that, tech is, fueling the information that comes from search engines. That's not saving media from, this feeling of distrust. And social media, as Dan said, is extremely low. If you look in the US, it's at 27 points. So that is, unbelievably low. And you only need to look at, what happened this fall with Facebook files and, sort of continued sort of feeling that, Facebook helped to, throw the election in 2016. There's the spread of misinformation on Facebook that social media is where you go to find, misinformation. It's not sort of a spreader of truth. And for those of us that are communicators in the audience, again, this is incredibly important because while yes, traditional media is trusted globally, in the US, it's still distrusted. So we have to really think of other forms of communication and other channels in which to get the message out on behalf of our clients. And then finally, information quality is seen as the most powerful trust builder across institutions more broadly. And so this is true for business, NGOs, government, and media. Information quality is incredibly important. And something that's not on this slide, I just want to mention quickly, is also that my employer media is actually trusted, which is very interesting. So if again, for those of us that are in comms, it's incredibly important to be delivering information to your employees because they are going to trust the information, especially if it's high quality information that's coming from employers. That's what's trusted, not necessarily even what they read in traditional media. And again, also employees are also a trusted voice on behalf of companies. So again, that's a really great way to get information out in a way that is compelling and clear and really illustrates what your company is doing. And finally, information can help close what they call the societal divide. So as you can see, there absolutely is a trust divide between high income and low income. And the idea is that good information can help close the gap here. So it's not just about sort of giving good information to those high income people. It's about giving good information across the board to sort of all the different stakeholders that matter to your business, whether it's people on the supply chain side, whether it's your customers, whether it's your investors. People are expecting high quality information across the board. And with that, that's the conclusion of our tech cut of the Trust Barometer. So we're happy, Arthi, to answer your questions. And then, of course, to answer any questions from the group, which I see have already sort of started coming in.
Yes. Well, thank you all. Yes. So thank you so much for that presentation. Really great. Elon Musk, of course, I knew that was going to come up. But, one thing that I think would be helpful, I think, Dan, you mentioned this early on in the presentation, is how are you all defining tech? I see that you all separated out technology and social media, but there's so many companies, right, that are sort of in this in between, like gig platforms, for example, like the Airbnbs and the Ubers and the DoorDashes of the world. Do those sort of fall under that tech umbrella? And then I'm curious if you all in the future are going to start, maybe spinning out Web 3.0 and crypto and, NFTs and things like that. So I'm just curious sort of if you all can define tech for the purposes of this presentation.
Yeah, so for the purposes of this presentation, technology is probably everything you're thinking of minus social media, which was broken out. Right. That said, it's a good point, and it's one we're continuing to look at, and I actually am hopeful that it's going to be a big portion of that secondary study I referenced, which is going to be the first time we're doing that, like an entirely separate survey about tech to kind of further diagnose what's going on here.
Right.
Because my hypothesis is that there's a handful of big tech companies and blurry lines between social media and other tech platforms or tech innovations that are revolutionizing or changing other industries that people are not quite clear on how to evaluate. And I think are having an impact on tech. We talk about this a lot, overseeing a tech department that has both enterprise and consumer tech. I think, there's a handful of companies that people go to. There's all kinds of invisible enterprise tech that is actually enabling, no hyperbole, us to stay alive, stay connected, be successful, that I think, is worthy of having a little more visibility in that equation. So we're looking forward to clarifying some of that.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and it sounds like you all are doing another.
Yeah, we're going to do one over the summer that will dig more into a lot of these issues and dig more into sort of the different subsectors.
Yes. Well, sure. We'll be back again to talk about that. And the audience questions are really good and they're coming in fast, but I do want to just establish a few things from the presentation, just clarifying. One was, what stood out to me was that the global trust in tech is on the rise, but it continues to fall in the US. And you'd mentioned some of the concerns that are driving the decline in the US, job loss, harassment, cyber attacks. Why do you think that's not tracking globally?
So a couple of things. One, remember when this was fielded. So this is the data from the field from late last year. So I think that as we look at this summer, we may see some dips or some plateauing in other markets, just given what was going on in the world at the time and what was going on in the US at the time. I also think, and I credit again my good friend Tonya on the research side. It matters less the moment in time data and look more at the trend. There are some markets that typically are just going to have higher trust levels because of cultural significance, because of cultural tendencies. And so, yes, the 13 points in China is a jump, and you're absolutely right. We're going to look at that. But I think we typically just see higher levels in that part of the world. And I think it relates to the importance of tech on their national economy, the contributions that tech made to the ascent of sort of China's position on the national stage. And I think that there's a sense of pride there that exists. And there's also a very clear sense of awareness in the US about some of the issues that tech really does need to solve.
Yeah. And if you think about it, Arthi, if you're in a developing country, which all had very high marks for tech, like India, that's what allows you, it's your smartphone, it's your computer. It's what allows you to sort of live a better life in a technology sort of enabled life. Whereas when you're in the US, it's, technology that's automation that's taking my job. So it's sort of a different relationship to what technology means in terms of people's sort of socioeconomic status as well.
And I want to sort of build on Peyton's question here because I think it fits in nicely. What does this mean for the US-China technological competition? And I think this is actually a really interesting second point piece. Could the US's decrease in trust hold us back from innovating or buying into R&D? And some of these are bigger questions than maybe even the scope of this discussion. But I thought it was worth even just to get your perspective.
Did you want to go first, and then I'm happy to answer as well.
No, I think as it relates to US-China, I think everyone's sort of watching what's going on across the board, even outside of tech. I think it is bigger than tech, but I do think tech is probably going to lead the way in terms of both R&D, supply chain, just tech business relationships. And I think that it's absolutely something we're going to look more closely into in the next study. As it relates to hindering US R&D, I don't know. I'd actually argue a more optimistic note. I think that the distrust among US respondents in the tech companies based here and doing work here will actually drive and force those tech companies to solve issues faster, to be more transparent, and to do better. And so I'd actually say that the US might be leading the dip, and we might see other markets follow in terms of a dip or a plateau, but then the US tech situation will rebound. When? I'm not sure. But I really do think that tech trust, tech will regain trust if it commits to better education, truly about like what it's even trying to do, what it's trying to solve. And if they share more evidence of how the industry is working to ensure employees and engineers are representative of the full community that they serve across the world, and how products and solutions actually can make this world a better place. Again, no hyperbole. And I think a cycle of distrust will actually fuel companies to have to do that.
I mean, again, this isn't sort of an obvious statement, but I mean, we're increasingly going into a world where you have sort of two worlds of tech, right? You have China tech, and you have the world of US tech. And that's true in social media. That's true in cloud. That's true in manufacturing. So we're just sort of, tech reflects sort of how the world in a lot of ways is bifurcating. And I think in some ways, going back to what Dan said, I think the US is going to be forced to innovate even more and manufacture more in the US and the Western world because of that sort of divide, political divide between China and the US. And then, I would also say like having some sense of, ethics around, AI, regulating things like facial recognition. To me, that's a really positive thing that the West brings to the world of technology, is a sense of sort of ethics around it and ways in which technology should be used and rules around the use of technology. That I think, for China, obviously you have, a vast population. You can obviously get a huge amount more data to do, then you can then perform AI on and all of that. But a lot of it, comes with a double-edged sword, right? Without sort of having some type of like ethical look at how the data should be used.
Another stat that really stood out to me was 60% of employees care about, their organization beliefs, and 68% in tech want their CEOs to speak out on some of the big issues of the day. And why that stood out to me is, we saw that, reaction to the messy conversations of 2020. I mean, Coinbase, right? Basecamp, they repositioned themselves as apolitical organizations. I think there were countless others that did so in a more tacit way. So, I mean, do you see sort of these two tracks where some organizations are continuing to foster conversations both internally and externally via leadership around big social issues, or are some sort of following the footsteps of the Coinbases and the Basecamps of the world and saying, look, we're just going to be, I think they call it mission focused, and not weighed in on issues that don't directly affect our business.
And I think what's interesting too is a lot of companies in tech are founder-led companies, right? You have Coinbase, it's a founder-led company. You have Facebook, it's a founder. Meta now, it's a founder-led company. Salesforce is a founder-led company. So in a lot of ways, you have companies that go with the ideology of the founder. So, you can look at the data all you want and say, okay, we should buy into trust. We shouldn't be investing in the communities. And I think if you're a CEO and you're ideologically leaning that way, maybe that is data that allows you to move that direction. I think clearly there's, as you said, there's another force in Silicon Valley that's sort of like, my business is my business, and you move more that way. And I think, again, because a lot of these are founder-led companies, what the founder and CEO decides to do is really where the direction the company goes in. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right.
I'd chime in on that based on a couple of the questions I'm seeing here and say, I think you're probably right, Arthi. I think there are, exactly as Mark said, two camps, people who are leaning into this data as justification for why leaning in more, and those who are, to be frank, ignoring it. And I think that what we will see play out over time is that companies, particularly tech companies, who commit to having their workforces and the products that they serve be representative of the needs of the entire world versus certain specific groups, will have more longevity. And I think this data backs that up.
Yeah. One of the things you said, Dan, at the beginning was, the era of just trust us is coming to an end in technology. And it seems to me like this basically means that tech is now going to be evaluated by what they do and less so by what they say. And with that in mind, are you seeing the role of CCOs change? Are CCOs playing a bigger role in developing policies, making operational decisions, not only at big tech companies, but also at Web 3.0 companies? Like, are we, as we enter this era, is the role of the CCO changing? Is it much more about what the organization does and not as steeped in what they're saying?
I think I am seeing firsthand from clients and just anecdotally that yes, it is about what companies are doing, not what they're saying. And luckily, where companies are doing it right, that increases the role of communications and its officers, because it tightens the relationship between comms and regulatory leaders, comms and marketing leaders, comms and sales leaders. comms and operations leaders. I'm noticing a trend within our tech portfolio of clients whose industries are not yet regulated and are not yet under the microscope. And the smartest clients will get in front of that and figure out how they want to lead that in the right direction. And that is a comms-led initiative. And that's, one, I think the right thing to do. And two, it's very cool for us as professionals to be at that table, helping drive actual decisions about what products are going to do and not do based on how it's going to play out.
And it is interesting, going back to sort of, Arthur, your question about, is this true not just for larger tech companies, but for sort of startups in the Web3 space, et cetera. And I think, you're absolutely right. I have a number of friends who are in VC or who are, leading some of these companies. And I think they're absolutely looking, in the comms world for people who can be partners to them, not for people who can just sort of get them, an audience with a reporter, but for people who can really advise on, how they should talk about, what decentralized finance actually means. How does it enable sort of the, people who are not necessarily part of the financial system to participate in it? Like, they're looking for people who can really be partners in helping to craft the messaging, and then also figure out who are the right stakeholders to communicate to, and also how to bridge sort of gaps between, what's going on in Washington in the regulatory environment and what's going on sort of in the world of the Valley and the world of crypto. So I think it's absolutely true that, these the CCO has become much more of a partner, and you only need to look at sort of how VC funds have sort of shaped themselves to see that in action. So, for example, if you look at Andreessen, it's a hugely services-driven fund. They've hired a number of people from sort of the regulatory world to come work with them, again, to help advise their portfolio companies. So really the way they've shaped their business model is truly around sort of the, communicator as partner, and communicator as key value add to their portfolio.
That makes me think, depending on where a company is in its life cycle, who they're trying to foster trust with probably shifts, right? Like for really early stage companies, it's investors and employees. They need folks to buy into their vision, and then as the company matures, that they look at it more holistically as their whole stakeholder ecosystem, right? And then trust ends up, touching much more aspects of both the company internally, but also externally. Are you all finding that sort of evolution in trust with your own clients, where early on they're hyper-focused on investors and employees, and then as the company grows, they think, oh, wow, we need to think more about trust with our customers, trust with our community, trust with other stakeholders beyond, folks who touch the business every day?
I would say yes and no. Yes, for more traditional products and services. For some of these newer things that are largely unknown, Web3, metaverse, NFT, crypto. I mean, I think they're also very aware of the education that they need to commit to about what they're actually doing and why it isn't scary, or why they say it isn't scary. And I think that's actually an interesting wrinkle that we're seeing, because you're right. Traditionally, no, it's like, let's get the money, let's get the customers, and then we'll care about everything else later. Right. I do think some of the smarter early stage companies are thinking longer term, which is another good thing for communicators.
Yeah. And I think a lot of ways companies, both sort of B2B companies and B2C companies, are sort of taking two approaches to communications. One of them is sort of the top down. They need to reach the C-suite, they need to reach investors. And then there's also the bottoms up part of it. And that's true sort of in enterprise tech world, where you want to reach developers, you want to reach them as well as sort of reaching the C-suite. And that's true sort of in the consumer world, where you want to get consumers on your side as well. So I think increasingly we're seeing that companies see, even from, startup stage, companies see both as important.
Yeah. And I think that this fits in nicely with Alicia's question about sort of, we all remember in 2019, the Business Roundtable, committed to sort of, the purpose of a corporation isn't just to maximize profits for shareholders, but it's actually to serve the larger stakeholder ecosystem. And then of course, COVID happened, and now we're, that conversations about what the stakeholder economy means seems to have shifted. And as we focus, right now where everyone's sort of in this recovery mode, but if you listen to the economists, there is a recession looming, right? It could be Q3, it could be Q4, it could be 2023. So where are we in this sort of stakeholder ecosystem, stakeholder like
I'll tell you something interesting right now is we're actually seeing a lot of work right now in employee relations, and in particular on labor relations.
Yes.
So working with a number of our clients to help them think through what does that sort of employer-employee contract look like, and we're actually working a number of employees at different companies are trying to unionize.
Right.
And if you look at Amazon, for example, which isn't our client, but they've just had employees unionize in New York, for example. So I think you're absolutely right that the idea of shareholder primacy definitely came through in the pandemic, but then the reaction of that is now workers are going back and saying, hey, that doesn't work for us. We basically kept everybody going through the entire pandemic. We were the ones showing up at work while people were behind their computers. And so I think it's maybe that perhaps that's some of the driving force behind sort of the union efforts we're seeing right now.
Well, and I guess part of it is, and I think this is what Alicia's getting to as well, is, it feels very situational, right? So COVID hits and then suddenly, some of these stakeholder priorities fall to the wayside. Right now, we're very much in a market where, employees are a premium. So now we've shifted to labor relations or, internal comms, employee engagement. If there's a recession, that's going to swing again. So it sounds like there's no real moral compass. Instead, it's being sort of really driven by the winds of the macro environment. I mean, that what
my reaction to that is context matters. And so I think that, when the market allows for more flexibility in reviewing sort of, as Margot said, stakeholder primacy, it will. And when it allows for less of that, I'd argue that the question that's being asked in boardrooms is more of to what extent, to what extent can we take the business and still serve who we need to serve, and also lean into some of these other indicators of trust and evaluators of trust. And so I think, I don't know that it isn't that there's a moral compass. I think there are natural limitations to the ability to do that based on what the market looks like.
So I'm going to go to Alicia's next question, which is, there's a very big trend towards sort of like-minded hives rather than embracing diversity of thought. And that seems to be affecting things like freedom of speech and such. How does that impact overall trust in tech? And I think this fits into some of the political
absolutely.
Right?
I mean, you just need to look at the data to see exactly how that comes through, right? I mean, you have sort of Republicans who have less trust in technology than the Democrats do. And as Dan said, sort of less trust overall. So you're absolutely right. And I also think social media obviously plays a huge amount into this, right? Because it's no longer you get your newspaper every morning. It's that, you can turn on cable news and you see vastly different things if you turn on Fox versus MSNBC. And you see even more different things if you are a staunch Republican logging into your Facebook page and look at what news is coming up for you versus if you're a Democrat. And then there's an even more niche version than that where people are now sort of joining specific community conversations. So for example, something like Discord, you can join and talk about different aspects of crypto, right? If you're into different areas of it to talk about. So it's there's so many different channels that technology has enabled to allow you to have sort of, almost more and more niche conversations. So I think you're completely right. And again, as comms professionals, our job is to understand what should the macro message be? How do we reach everybody? And then also how do we reach those sort of niche stakeholder groups in, the areas where they're engaged in to get our message out as well.
Yeah, and I'll chime in.
Go ahead, Dan.
I was just going to chime in and say, as it relates to the like-minded hives and sort of now it's just two camps and no diversity of thought and also sort of some of the other questions around, leadership decisions and board seat purchases that are happening within tech. I'm still a bit on a South by Southwest high, and some things that we heard there were really interesting. One panel I attended, full disclosure, client of ours, HP, reminded the room that HP has a commitment to be, the most socially just company, and they're really working on diversity of representation within their ranks. And so I think that companies need to do more, specifically tech companies, to make sure that we aren't pitting ourselves into two hives or worse, one, and that we really do have diversity of all kinds across tech. It's the most important. Tech is the most pervasive industry. It is the most pervasive thing in our lives. So it needs to be built by and for everyone. So that's one thing. And then in terms of this Elon Musk question that I just keep reading over and over, it's interesting. We've seen all the memes, we've seen all the jokes about the money could have done and what it's doing. I think that it's more likely that things like that would happen in tech versus other industries, just because of the type of tech leader we usually see and the amount of money.
It's that almost cult of the founder, right?
Yep, totally. And I think that remains to be seen what intentions were and what's done, because I'd argue that there could be a lot of really good things to happen from that.
A lot of people think so too. The stock price, I think, went up nearly 10%. So I think a lot of investors are thinking the same thing.
So my question is to your point about, this for technology, because of the culture of the founder, we should expect sort of this, these types of memes and jokes. But so where would you advise for your clients some of these conversations play out? It feels like for the tech sector, it's very much centered around Twitter. I mean, we saw, it was just a couple of days ago, the VP of comms from Substack was basically chimed in about how if you're uncomfortable with Elon Musk joining Twitter, then don't apply for a job here. And the way these conversations are playing out, it almost feels a bit like mischievous tricksters, like winking at each other and these in-jokes. I mean, what do you think that does in terms of trust? I mean, do you think that it feels like there is this closed ecosystem where people are speaking to each other on platforms like Twitter without thinking about how that's going to hit folks outside of that very insular community? Or, I mean, is this authentic to who the technology sector is, and it plays really well for those stakeholders, like, in this case, potential employees?
I mean, I would say that's part of why I think our data is so compelling, because it is like there's this sort of, as you said, group of insiders. They know each other, they tweet at each other. You can absolutely see that in the Valley. It's almost like, you or at like a dinner party with all the cool kids if you're following these people on Twitter. But then when you actually look at the data around trust in tech and see that it's significantly gone down in the US, most tech companies, they sell into customers all across the United States and globally. They have employee bases that are outside of Silicon Valley. They need license to operate in Washington. So there is such a bigger ecosystem than sort of this Silicon Valley echo chamber. Or, I know Elon Musk moved to Austin, Dan, so I'm going to include the Austin Silicon Valley echo chamber. And so I think, again, that's why this data is so compelling, is really because it does illustrate that there is a much bigger world out there who don't necessarily think the same way, have the same sort of orientation towards tech. And again, why then it's so important for companies to think in a more macro, or CEOs in particular, and companies to behave and think in a more macro way that encompasses sort of more of a stakeholder view. Right. And do things like retraining programs, investing in the communities in which they operate, things that allow them to be seen sort of as a good actor and a positive actor in society.
And I think, Arthi, to expand on that, I do think for the most part it's the platform of communications that many tech leaders have chosen allows them to be very authentically themselves. And I would argue that is driving some of the volatility in the trust levels within tech in the US. Volatile behavior from leadership within tech results in volatile responses of trust levels. And right. I think that's why there's a lot of like, let's watch the trend, let's watch what happens, and let's see how it may or may not recover as things stabilize and people get a better sense of, actually why did we purchase a board seat at Twitter? Why are we doing some of these investments? Why are we saying some of these things? And sometimes there is no why, and sometimes there is.
I want to bring this back for a moment to, folks' day-to-day lives. So, with the data that we're seeing, what role do you see CMOs playing? Because we've talked a little bit about CCOs and the role that they should be playing. What about CMOs? And are these two roles, the CMOs and the CCOs, are you seeing them having to work more closely together to build corporate narratives that enable trust? Or are you still seeing silos where these two organizations don't work as closely together, or where comms is, reporting into the marketing, which still happens more frequently than I remember the predictions of 10 plus years ago. I'm sure you all, or some of you on this call, may remember, where it was going to be a turf war, and then it was going to be the CCO was going to emerge the victor, or some people thought they were going to be subsumed into one role. I think I've heard various like chief storyteller. So I don't think there hasn't been a clear, definitive, all right, this is what happened. It seems to still be very organizationally dependent. So I'm just curious from what you all are seeing in terms of how the expectations around marketing and the role that they should play in trust, in building trust.
What I'm seeing, and I'm interested on Margot's take too, is that it is still organizationally dependent. And I would say for the most part, I think tech is not the leading industry when it comes to the tightest integration between comms and other departments. That said, I think it's getting better. And what I'm seeing is an increase in, and here we are talking about data, an increase in communicators and marketers' reliance upon data to drive the storytelling, to drive the product innovation, to drive the sales mechanisms, to drive the thresholds for when to engage and not engage, which is a good thing. And I think that's actually allowing people to reach across aisles in every sense of that phrase. And so I would hope and encourage that we use data more to drive more of that.
Yeah, and we work with some companies where the CCOs then became the CMOs. So, we've definitely seen sort of progression that way. So I think, there absolutely is a link between the CCO role and the CMO role. And what, again, we've seen from our data, at least, is that there is more of a link within consumers of a company's reputation and then a desire to buy the company's product. So again, going back to the data that we showed earlier that showed that over 50% of consumers say they buy a product based on a company's beliefs, that again directly shows that intersection of a company's reputation and then the ability to market its products. So at least our belief is that they're, increasingly converging, even if, as Dan said, there's, some organizations really do still have them separate.
Yeah. I'm thinking about what Dan said about, being an organization for everyone and all, in diversity in all of its forms, and how that increasingly feels impossible, and how organizations should really manage this. In fact, I was talking to an organization the other day, and they were going to, part of what they wanted to say publicly is, we want to be a place for everybody, diversity of all kinds, diversity of, race and ethnicity and gender identification and political views. And they actually ended up pulling back the political view piece of it, because that opens up this question of can all political views coexist together, right? I mean, if you believe that, if you believe that being gay is wrong, right, then can you coexist in an organization that is welcoming to the LGBTQ community, right? Yeah. So I really, this has been a conversation that's not.
Increasingly, if you look at Disney, organizations are being forced. You can't just stay silent. You have to have an opinion. It's almost like staying silent means you're, sort of tacitly endorsing a position that maybe a lot of your consumers and your employees don't like.
Right.
And I would suggest that it is not incumbent upon organizations to be welcoming to all if behavior or beliefs are contrary to that company's mission. And so it is critical that the companies build their missions based on an entirely inclusive approach, and the input from all that they serve. They don't have to talk about all of it. They don't have to take a stand on all of it.
Right.
But they do need to have the input and the understanding from everyone, especially those they disagree with.
Is that where we end up back to a Coinbase situation where, because this does get very messy, right? Do you just say, all right, we're not going to talk about these issues because there's not a consensus, and there will be a third of our workforce or a third of our consumers that will not be happy with what we have to say about this. So we're going to focus on our mission at hand and only have a stance on issues related directly to our business.
And I would argue that is a shortcut, and it's lazy, and it's not at all what we need to do.
Right.
And that what I mean is that we need to evaluate the missions themselves and make sure that they are inclusive, and then execute based on that.
Yeah, Margot, it's almost like being apolitical becomes a political stance. It becomes almost a libertarian stance. So I think that has very much a message in and of itself.
Yeah, but especially if you're in a consumer facing sector, right? You are going to forever be dealing with the same thing over and over again, like we're seeing with Disney right now, right? There is a third of your consumers are never going to be happy. And I suppose what you're saying, Dan, is that because of that, instead of operating from a place of consensus, you should operate from a place of what are my values, and hold yourself accountable to that instead of making every single stakeholder happy.
Yes, and if those values end up meaning that you have to exclude certain groups, make sure you get the input of everyone before you determine that mission and what those values are.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
No assumptions. Use the data.
Use the data. So we are wrapping. We need to wrap up soon. I'm getting lots of pings here. We need to wrap up at 11:55. So that is exactly the time. So thank you, audience, for your great questions. Thank you, Margot and Dan. This was a great conversation as always. I feel like there were so many threads that we could have gone so much deeper in, but hopefully the next research that you all are doing over the summer will give us an opportunity to do that.
We might include a question just on Elon Musk. No, I'm
yes,
just kidding. There was so much focus
at this point. You have to at this point. All right, so Karen, I think I'm handing it back to you for closing.
Great, thank you, Margot. Oh, there we go. Thank you, Arthi, Margot, and Dan. We so appreciate your time. This was so valuable, and I also want to say a shout out to all the folks that were contributing those great questions today. Really appreciated that. So thank you, Edelman, and thank you so much to our other sponsors, Hotwire, Manhattan Strategies, and Signalcast. We've got some other great shows this month. Let's see. Do you want to show the calendar, Paul? We've got next week, we've got a show on DEI, Diversity 101, and DEI case studies. And then on the 22nd, we've got social media and thought leadership with our friends from Manhattan Strategies. So thank you again, everyone, and happy Friday. Have a great weekend. And thanks for joining our 75th show. I looked it up. It's the diamond anniversary. So if anyone wants to send me jewelry, I will put my address in the chat. Thank you again, and we'll talk next week. Bye.